Welcome to the Famous or Forgotten podcast, the making or missing of great artists. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very exciting season finale of the Famous or Forgotten podcast. Today, we are going to dive in to our overall learnings from this season, share some insights. Today, we, of course, have Alex, Clyde, and Mary. In no particular order of importance there. It just happened to be the order that everyone was in on my screen. Excited to dive into this with everyone, and very fortunate for everyone that's listening along to go through this journey with us. This is a great learning experience, and I think we have some great takeaways from everything that we learned as far as action items are concerned. For folks looking to, quote-unquote, make it as an artist. So, as prep for this episode, we put together some of our findings, and I think that one thing that kind of came out of this, Mary, this is one that you had noted, was finding the right partner / supporters / champions. So I'd love to, hear your thoughts on how important you think that is for artists.
Yeah. I was really thinking about Paul's episode when I wrote that down, and how he was talking about, doing research into the right gallery can make all the difference, because if you want a gallery to represent you, they have to be able to represent your type of art and your uniqueness in that way. And then I was also thinking about that story that Pat shared about being in New York, just for a couple days, and coincidentally running into someone, a dealer, was it? And it just kind of working out in that way. And so I think that's something that struck me throughout this podcast journey. Something that I've realized is how much is putting in that hard work and doing your research and reaching out and putting yourself out there. And then also how all of that hard work can sometimes lead up to what seems like a coincidental moment where something happens to work out, and kind of how those two sides, those two different vibes kind of work together and can work together in an artist journey.
Sure.
Yeah. And also thinking about Reed and Pat and how they've championed these artists who have passed away, and how, if you can surround yourself with support like that while you're creating your art, then there's that hope that people will carry it on as your legacy after you're gone. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a prime takeaway from this. And it's just kind of been doing some of the recordings of these episodes. Alex, I believe you pointed that out early on. It's kind of it seems like, having that, it's a cliche, but I think it's an important one to bring up here. The your network is your net worth kind of cheesy saying. It very much plays into what we're learning with the art world as well.
Yeah, 100%. It seems to be a lot about the connections. And it's interesting in a world of art where you have, it should be creative expression and freedom and all that. There is a sense of it's still business. Art is still a business. And in order to progress your business, if your business is your artwork, it is about your network, finding your champions, people that are going to open the doors for you, to introduce you to the right galleries, put you in the right shows, introduce you to potentially dealers that have a network of buyers that are interested. Then it was interesting in the episode that we had with Paul Gratz, he mentions the story of Lynn Mapp Drexler, which we were kind of on our journey ourselves to find out what happened. And as he dove into it, it's, Lynn Mapp Drexler was selling for $10,000 one day. And then shortly after, there's an auction and it sells for over $1 million. How does that happen? It doesn't happen by accident. It's planned. There's a network involved. And you look down the line of stories where you have certain famous art dealers find a specific estate, and they are able to manifest that estate into some type of large value. So as an artist, having connection to those people that can do that and can carry that weight with their introduction is important. And at the very least, if you are not able to or don't want to do that during your lifetime, but you want to create a legacy, organization in your artwork, at least writing the dates, maybe some titles, or if it's up to perspective, at least dates would be important for whoever's going to carry the legacy forward.
Definitely. And you brought up a great point about, of course, the legacy component of it as well. But you also brought up a point about folks that come into a large collection, like an entire body of work. And that was actually a point that Clyde brought up that he found interesting. So Clyde, wanted to give you the floor and see, your thoughts on, these, because we saw it with Reed and his father's collection. And then we also saw it with Paul, how he came into Peter Miller's entire body of work. So love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I kind of had it jotted down as a note in my notes as, you come across a large body of work, whether it's at a state or you stumble upon or it's you inherit it, whatever the case may be. Is it a blessing or is it a curse? Because we're finding out that it's not so easy, right? It's part of this large machine that you have to figure out how you fit in. And this kind of goes back to another point. So like going into this project, I was kind of naive, right? I used to believe that, there's this metaphysical part of art where it's like, if the message or the voice of the art is strong enough, it'll get out there somehow, right?
Right.
And I think that happens, right? But it's definitely not often, right? It's definitely a lot that goes into it. But then going back to that point where it's like, you come across a body of work, that's when the work really starts, and it's not so easy. You can't really, expect of how I think people that wouldn't have done this research that we have done, expect that there's a lot of work that goes behind it, that we just kind of think of, oh, I found art, now I can sell it for millions of dollars. And it takes a lot of work to get there.
For sure, definitely. And, in with that, and I do have to mention Pat is also, I didn't mention her in the intro to that question, but Pat is in that same boat, of course, having her late husband's entire body of work as well. But, a big part of what we're talking about here, though, too, having this body of work that you're now responsible for. One of the things that jumped out to me that Paul brought up, I think he kind of brought it to the forefront, at least in my mind, was the importance of telling a story and having that story in place and how important that is for getting an artist's work out there. And I think that kind of wraps everything that we've talked about so far today into one neat little package where, you have the network and all the people, like, okay, how are you going to introduce it to them? You have to have that story. And then also just everything Paul's done with Peter Miller and Reed's done with his father's work and everything Pat's done. It's all about that story. And if anyone has anything for that one.
I mean, yeah, and you look at what is the story. Is it 100% fact? And maybe it is. Maybe there's a little bit of fiction in there. And also, how is it tied to today's times? You look at someone like Peter Miller, Lynn Mapp Drexler. You can go down the line of artists, specifically previously female artists that did not get the recognition that they deserved. Now that is a story that's relevant to today's time. So you are able to then leverage it if you are either the artist yourself or you now have inherited this body of work, this estate. You now have the makings. If the records were kept, you have information about the art, you can now weave it into a story. Now, being a female artist is not enough, right? There needs to be a lot more to that. And as part of that, I think that's where the organization is key. And then from there, it becomes a matter of branding. We see historically that artists that tend to stick to a specific style, that get branded in that style, are left with that. So the story becomes a little bit easier. But in anything you do, the reason the story is so important is because it becomes an easy way to sell it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to dig into one of Clyde's other points about how has COVID impacted the art world. Again, this is one that Paul brought up primarily. The impact of the ability to look at art online and make purchases like that. Throughout this series, we didn't really dive into NFTs or anything like that. Maybe that'll come up in the next season, but I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on where does the online world fit in with everything that we've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject, right? Because I feel like we're now like on the cusp of like a lot of emergent trends and technologies, and obviously, pandemic was a pretty huge one that we hadn't experienced at such a level, and it shifted a lot of industries, and I don't think any other industry, particularly art world, was really immune to it. So it really did kind of detach from that whole aspect of like location, right? We know location is important. We know that you have to be there, but the pandemic kind of just made it so it's like, well, you don't have to have location at this point because we don't have it. And then, it did change that. And kind of what Paul was alluding to, where it's like, they kind of, didn't know what to expect. They didn't know how it was going to affect the industry. And somehow it became their most profitable, most busiest time ever, as Paul described it. So, I think art will always adapt to whatever's thrown at it. I know we're moving towards more of not being face-to-face, not being in person, just being more online. With VR coming up, with all these technologies that are coming up, like I'm sure it's going to affect art in some ways. It would be interesting to dissect of like where that would, where art would be in 20 years, 30 years from now.
Definitely. Mary, what are your thoughts on
the
role?
I posed this question on Reddit on a couple of different threads and got some interesting answers from kind of both artists and buyers. And like a lot of people were saying, they really enjoyed like being able to find artists on social media because they could like follow the artist directly, buy directly from the artist, kind of get to see the artist's journey. And it kind of creates that connection of like being able to see their work over time and like purchasing directly from the artist. They know like all the proceeds are going directly to the artist, which people seem to like. And so that was like encouraging to hear. And then there were also some other some artists who were saying that there was almost kind of like this golden age for like Instagram kind of earlier. I want to say like pre-pandemic when it was a bit like younger, where it was a lot easier to become noticed on Instagram. But now it's like with however the algorithms have changed and just how much stuff is now populating social media, it's almost like the work of creating content that does well in the algorithm and like gets you noticed becomes too much of a job comparative to the art. So I think there's some different sides to that of like, it's great that we can connect, but an artist wants to create art. They don't want to create content. Those are two different things. And creating content, I think, can quickly become like a full-time job of marketing yourself. And then you don't have any time. And I'm assuming you're also probably creatively burnt out to actually create the art. So I think it's a tricky space. And I think, like Clyde says, definitely gonna change as things evolve. So it's interesting. I think there's pros and cons there, definitely.
Absolutely. And one of the other points that you brought up in kind of prepping for this episode, Mary, was the spiritual side of art. And I think that is kind of parallel to, the creative side of art versus the promotional side of things. What was your, what do you think was your takeaway as far as, artists diving into the spiritual creative side?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard. And I thought about this a lot listening to Pat's episode and then also Barbara's, because she brought up how kind of like when an artist knows their painting is like going to sell for millions of dollars, it can kind of like ruin their creativity in a way. Like I think it can get in your head. And then on the flip side, I think with social media, there's kind of, and with just like the gig economy, all of that, there's kind of this push to try to monetize hobbies or creative endeavors or art, which I think can be great. But at the same time, it's important to remember, like, to be creative, I think at the heart of being creative, it has nothing to do with monetization or business or that sort of thing. Like, you're not meant to be pumping out a bunch of stuff all the time. You're meant to like have slow moments and reflect and like connect. And that's where like I personally find my creativity and that sort of thing. So I think something I was thinking about a lot like throughout this podcast is kind of balancing that. And even with like Sam Feinstein, how he went so into the spiritual creative side of his art that he like wasn't even dating it, wasn't even signing it, was fully rejecting that commercial side. So I think it's something that, every artist kind of has to take a look at and prioritize for themselves. Am I going to prioritize the business side right now and like really get myself out there? Or is maybe art just going to be something I do for myself and share occasionally, and I'll stick with my day job? I think that's something everyone has to like choose for themselves.
Sure.
It's interesting if I can jump in here, because as you're talking about this, Mary, I'm kind of going through the motions of like, I understand that cutoff of like, if money's introduced, it kind of infringes with creativity, but maybe we should start having our listeners think about where it's, the value of art will make sure that it sustains its life. Because if something's valuable, then it's not going to be discarded. It's going to be protected. It's going to be sought after. So I feel like they need to start thinking it from that aspect where it's like, it needs to create that monetary value that to make sure it could sustain itself throughout, because I think ultimately the artist just wants to make sure that that work is being viewed, is been sought after, and it continues to exist after they're gone. So I think value to art could be looked at as, it's kind of like its own little trust fund built within art that, it'll have to survive.
Absolutely. And I think a nice, easy step from that point, Clyde, is your next point about how there's a difference between the message of the art versus the craft of the art, the craftsmanship of the art. Alex, I know you and I had extensive conversations about this too, after the conversation with Bill Valerio, where it was kind of like, oh, he seems to be more message. Paul is more craft. So, Heidi, if we could start with you, I'd love to hear your take on it. Then Alex, kind of reflecting on that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it just kind of goes down to, I think, what the artist is really trying to put out. And I think an artist that really truly cares about their work, I think they're going to focus on the craftsmanship. And I think on the other side, the ones that are maybe focused on commercial and want to make as much money as possible are going to focus on the hype that their work is, going to generate. But ultimately, I feel like, especially in our world, hype carries a lot more weight than craftsmanship. It's going to get more eyes on it, more viewership, and it's going to create a general buzz, which then will contribute to the value of it just because of that hype. So yeah, I'm kind of torn on this subject, and definitely interested to hear all your thoughts. But yeah, it is one of those I think conundrum is that the good word to use?
That's a good word.
Where it's do you focus on craftsmanship, or maybe you just look at about from a hype? So as long as you're creating hype, no matter what you put out there, it's going to catch value.
I remember Bill Lario was struggling a little bit with this as he was saying it, because he didn't necessarily want to say that the craftsmanship doesn't necessarily matter. I think it certainly does within the scope of historical significance. So you talk about hype, and hype being the current significance of a specific piece. It might be relevant today, but may not be relevant tomorrow. So you had the hype, but then the value's gone. Adding historical significance should come with some level of craftsmanship and quality in the message so that it can sustain, essentially be something that's either very historically significant to that area because it was the best representation of something, which usually has craftsmanship built in, I would assume, and also capitalizes on what's going on today, what's the best way for me to market this today. So there is, I think, that balance of, I think ultimately what Bill got to is, and that Paul kind of validated, is there has to be some threshold for craftsmanship as the foundation. And then you can market off of that or build off of that.
I absolutely agree. And that was kind of my observation too. I know you and I talked a lot about that conversation with Bill, just because it was a really interesting thing to see him kind of internally work through, being with him in person and feeling that. So the final point to round things out, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. It seems like a recurring theme that kept coming up, and I think it came up most with Pat, is the idea of just keep taking the shots, just keep going for it, keep trying new things. Clyde, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, is persistence, right? And going back to what Mary said earlier, where it's like, you can go at it for years, right? And then it takes just a serendipitous, like bumping into someone, right? Just out of a whim, and then boom, it can just change the entire course of like the projects and everything that you've been doing up to that point. And I think that kind of resonates. Just stick at it, because one of these, luck or whatever you want to call it, is you got to be in the game in order to be lucky. I think as long as you maintain that passion, it should be pretty straightforward and easy to do, but it's easier said than done sometimes.
Definitely. Alex, Mary, you want to dive into that one?
Yeah, I guess, as part of that, like, I think we went into this podcast, like, let's figure out the art market. And I think I'm coming out of it, like, it's still very mysterious and works in its own mysterious ways. And so I think part of that is, like, definitely just keep putting yourself out there, keep trying different things. And, at the end of the day, like, there obviously are these, like, huge, well-known, famous artists. A lot of them weren't even well-known in their time. And art is subjective. So who knows when you're going to find, like, the person that absolutely loves your art and wants to bring it to the world. I think just keep trying till you find your right audience.
Yeah, I'll add that if you want to be great and be considered great beyond your lifespan or create a legacy for yourself, being fully ramped up in one area is not going to get you there, right? Just like life is not just about one specific greatness. There's a well-rounded piece that needs to kind of evolve as well. And part of that for a lot of artists, the most difficult part may be the marketing, the connections, and kind of selling your art, which if that's not something that you even want to do, then find the right people to be around you that can help you with that. In general, you need to be well-rounded in order to be, to make it as a great artist.
Absolutely.
To be remembered as a great artist.
Absolutely. And, just for what it's worth, Alex and I, when we started this, the phrase that came to mind to me was like, we're just two unapologetic capitalists trying to understand the art market. So, just in the world of business, the same applies. You keep taking shots, keep going for it. And eventually, out of nowhere, something works. And, I think that we saw that keep coming up throughout this podcast. And it seems like it is true in so many other areas as well. Any final thoughts before we round things out?
I think, like Mary said, we went into this trying to understand what it takes to make it as an artist, and we found that the depth and intertwined road to that is very nuanced and different for many people. So we'll keep exploring it as we go through the next series, and hopefully, continue to share valuable insights with everyone.
Yeah. I've definitely learned a lot on this journey. And I think just art's something that's always going to be around, even in our ever changing world and internet landscape and whatnot. So I think just keep creating it and seeing what happens.
Absolutely. Well, it was a pleasure recording this episode with everybody. On behalf of Alex, Clyde, and Mary, again, in no particular order, other than that's just where everyone's at on my screen. We want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed going on this journey with us. Keep an eye on the feed for season 2 when that kicks off. And we hope you enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to seeing you all again when the Famous or Forgotten podcast comes back. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Famous or Forgotten podcast. We hope you found it insightful, educational, entertaining, and everything else that goes into a great podcast. We are always looking for folks to provide insights into this conversation around artists and what makes them succeed or not. If you feel like you have some insights to provide to this show, feel free to check the podcast notes below, or if you're watching on YouTube, in the show description. Our contact information is there. You can get in touch, and we'd love to start the conversation with you and allow you to provide any kind of insights that you think might be helpful. Stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next episode.